All right, welcome class. Today I'm going to talk about interaction rituals and social contact. What this is going to do is provide you a framework for how I make sense of conversation and how this framework can help you make sense of what you need to do as a conversation partner and as someone who studies conversation. So let's get to it. Okay, so we live in what I call a secularly religious society. So, what do I mean by that? I mean that we live in a society where, and at least this applies to, Western culture, United States area, um, we we've organized our social lives around something that we regard as the ultimate. But in this case, the ultimate is not a higher power or supreme being. The ultimate is around each other's egos, or what I'm going to call later face wants. Okay? So let's try to make this a little bit more concrete. So, in our society or in our everyday interactions, we tend to do seemingly inefficient things out of respect for others, okay? And we build our interactions and our conversations around these inefficiencies to make sure that we are still doing something that's socially acceptable. Now, let me give you some examples of this. And the best place to go to demonstrate this is to childhood socialization. So, the problem that kids face is that they they look at the world and they are very efficient, okay? And they just see the world for what it is. They don't really understand things like reputation, fitting in. When they're very young, they don't care about those things. They're just thinking about themselves. I mean, that's something that we don't have to teach a child to be selfish, right? They're already born that way because they don't know any better. And children will do very efficient things, but we have to teach them not to do it, even though it's efficient. So let's take a look at quite a few examples of this. It might be really efficient to pee in public, right? To just pee in the corner or even pee in your pants. But we tell kids, if you gotta go, you gotta hold it, and you have to go to this room called the bathroom, and then you gotta pee in the toilet, and then you have to flush it, and then you have to wash your hands, and then you can go about your business. It might be really efficient for a child when they're at the dinner table to just eat spaghetti with their hands. What? It's a lot easier than using a fork. It goes into your mouth, no problems, right? But we have to teach our kids table manners, and we have to teach them, even if that's the easiest way to do it, eating spaghetti with your hands, it's not the most polite or the most socially acceptable way to eat at a table. So you need to learn how to use a fork, even if it's more of a pain than using your hands. It might be really efficient for a kid to blurt out the answer in class, right? When the teacher asks a question, why not just blurt out the answer? Well, and some teachers would be okay with that, but what often happens is a child is told you got to raise your hand before you talk. Even if you save the classroom time because you knew the answer and you said it, we still have to respect other people and giving them a chance to, contribute to the discussion. So we have then these trade-offs, okay? So we have this trade-off between, on one end, efficiency, and on the other end, sociality is what I'll call it. And the reason our social lives are so complex is that there's always an efficient way to do something. The problem is it often trades off with sociality. I mean, it would be just efficient to tell your neighbor that you don't like them, so quit asking me to do stuff with you because I don't like you, I think you're annoying, blah, blah, blah. So we could be really efficient, but then, we hurt the neighbor's feelings. The neighbor might go tell everybody else what's going on, and we just would feel like a horrible person, right? If you told your neighbor that they were annoying, at least most of us probably would. Maybe you have a really annoying neighbor, but I'm not sure about that. But this is our life, basically. This whole little continuum that we live is about this, okay? Now, I don't think the social world would necessarily be a better place if everyone was just efficient and we just got rid of sociality. I mean, it's kind of like you want the truth, you can't handle the truth, right? Or it would just be very direct, and I don't think it would be good for everybody, right? If we just kind of said whatever was on our mind, did the most efficient thing, just peed in public, ate with our hands, that kind of thing. Now, here's the thing about life then. Not only do we have to worry about this, we also have to often get things done in life involving the compliance of other people, okay? So, for example, you might have to ask your professor for an extension for a deadline. So now you have to be efficient, and you have to be social, and you have to be respectful of your professor's needs, right? Because the efficient way to do it would be like, hey, professor, can you give me a deadline extension? And maybe that would be good. Or, hey, professor, give me a deadline extension, for that matter. It would be really efficient. We'd get what you're saying. But then your professor might be like, but you're demanding it. You're not asking nicely for it. Think about the classic thing, can you pass me the salt, please, right? What does please really do that changes the nature of the demand? Well, please doesn't really make it any easier to pass you the salt, but please indicates a sort of respect, right? And so it takes the demands of being efficient and tries to also add a social aspect to it. Now, in life then, and in social life, we have this thing called face. And face is the positive value that someone claims for him or herself in a particular context, okay? So face is the positive value that someone claims for him or herself in a particular context. So when you ask your professor for a deadline extension, or let's say you want to contest your grade, you want to be efficient in that you want to get your point across and all of that, but you also want to be very aware of the positive value that your professor is trying to claim for him or herself. So you don't want to call your professor an idiot, right? You don't want to say, you obviously don't pay attention when you grade because you did this, 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 and this. Because even if it might be true, you're still attacking your professor's face and you're putting them on the defensive, see? So it might be efficient, but it's not very social. And you'll probably, if you anger your professor by saying such a thing, you probably won't get what you want. So it turns out it's not even probably going to be efficient anyways in the long run, but maybe it would be. So face then is this positive value that people claim for themselves, and a lot of our social life involves saving face and protecting this thing that we call face. Now, face could be related to the ego, like you've probably heard of, in psychology classes, and if you've ever studied Sigmund Freud, the ego, and this is not ego like the waffle, this is ego. So there, the ego is, kind of like your self-image, your self-esteem, and all of that. And that's kind of the psychological version of face. But face is a very social aspect, and we'll kind of try to dissect the two. But they are kind of two sides of the same coin to a certain degree. But we'll talk a little more about that later on. Now, why is face valuable? Why do we care about how people want to be seen in public? In other words, why should we care about it? Well, every time you open your mouth, face is at stake, right? If you raise your hand in class and say something incredibly wrong or hurtful or all of that, that is a problem because you could be seen as incompetent, right? And then now you seem less smart to the class. Or if you say something that's offensive, people might think you're immoral, that you're a terrible human being, and all of that. Now, before I talk about the main values of face then, I want to bracket this real quick. There are two aspects to face that I want to make sure I mention. And the two aspects, or you can call them the two layers, it doesn't matter. Okay. First, you have competence. So, one thing that everyone wants to make sure they have when they're in an interaction is they want to be seen as competent, right? Um, Without competence, we can't really advance in our society. So, like, if you're seen as dumb and not smart and incapable and incompetent, I mean, it's hard to move up in the world, right? Because nobody thinks you're credible, nobody can trust you because they don't think you know what you're doing. And, you end up working a low paying hourly job, and it's just hard to advance. You want to move up, you want to get that nice car, nice house, whatever. You can't do that if you're making $9 an hour. So you want to be seen as competent. And we can think of examples of how somebody isn't necessarily mean to you, but they talk down to you, or they talk to you like maybe that you're stupid, right? We've probably have had those experiences before where somebody really talked down to you and you're just like, man, this person really made me talk to me like I was dumb or something like that. Okay? So that's an attack on your competence. The second aspect then is your morality. Okay? And morality has to do with your respect to ethics and the concern for others. And think of, for example, Bill Clinton, right? Bill Clinton is a good example of somebody who was, politics aside, somebody who was probably competent, right? But because of his affair, he wasn't seen as moral, okay? And then we can also think of people who are extremely moral, really nice people, but just not the best at their jobs, right? Tim Tebow might be an example of this. Everyone, these, people in certain parts of the United States really like Tim Tebow as a person and all that, but he's not the best quarterback in the world. So you got to have both of these. And we want to try to protect both of these. We don't want to be seen as a terrible human being, and we don't want to be seen as an incapable human being, right? We want to be seen as both. Now, here's why face has value then. The first reason is reputation, okay? So when you talk to people in a community, okay, because the assumption is that you're operating in a community where people are connected in some way. Your reputation is what precedes you, and it's what comes after you. So if I talk to person A and she says that I'm awesome, then when person A goes and meets person B and tells them how awesome I am, then when I meet person B, I have less work to do, right? Person B will hear I'm great, I'm cool, and I have less to do now. But if the opposite happens, I have this terrible interaction with person A, right? And I just treat them terribly. And then person A goes and tells person B how awful of a human being I am, then person B is probably not going to treat me very well either. And that's how you run into problems with getting bullied and all of that. Next, you have emotion. So reputation is important because this has to do with the social aspect. If you have a bad reputation, then it's just hard to advance in a community, right? It's hard for people to sympathize to you, and that's how you become isolated. That's how you get bullied. That's how you get kicked out. That's how you get last dibs on everything. Poor reputation. So this is social in nature. Emotion is physical in nature. So face has a strong emotional tie to it as well. Losing face, right? Being embarrassed, getting humiliated. That can hurt your feelings. And it can make you cry, right? If you've ever had a terrible experience before where you just felt so embarrassed or so humiliated or somebody just made you feel so terrible, there's an emotional aspect to it. And we just don't want to protect our own of these. We're also trying to protect others, right? Part of the reason breaking up is so hard to do, right, is that it's emotional in nature. If you know it's going to cause your partner to hurt, then, that's going to hurt their emotions, and it sucks watching somebody cry, right? Especially when you're the cause of it. So this is why breaking up is so hard to do, is that emotion aspect. Now, because we have empathy then, we care about this. We care about emotion, our own emotions and other people's emotions. Now, if you don't have empathy and you don't care if people cry and if people hurt and all that, I mean, you are technically either, I think you're a sociopath in that case, or a psychopath, one or the other. I don't know the difference between the two, but you're one of those. You don't have the ability to feel empathy, and that's a problem. Okay, I'll just say that. Okay, so let's keep going. Now, here's why this is important. Face is a condition for interaction. It's not just a goal. So these are like key takeaways about face. Oftentimes, we give a speech, right? Because we want people to think we're competent, that we know our material, that we're believable, and all that stuff. And so certainly face can be a goal sometimes of an interaction to enhance it and all that. But more or less, in everyday interaction, face is a condition for interaction. In other words, it's a parameter. We try to have our interactions while protecting each other's face, okay? So we restrict the decisions that we make. We word things certain ways so that we can protect the face of others, because if we don't do that, we either feel terribly about it, or we develop a reputation of not protecting people's faces, and that's how we become isolated in a community, in a workplace, in a school, anything like that. So face is more or less a parameter, a condition, so I'll even write parameter in case you prefer that word instead. So in most interactions. Now, there certainly can be contexts where the loss of face is not a concern, okay? Think about disciplinary situations, boot camps. The drill sergeant isn't really caring about your face, or if a principal is scolding a child, or if a parent is scolding their child, face is not as much of a concern, right? And unfortunately, bullying is another context where face is not a concern for the bullied. Now, the sad thing about bullying is that usually the reason for that is not a good one. The kid talks different, the kid is smaller, the kid looks different, whatever, and those are terrible. In a disciplinary situation, the reason they can not care as much about face is because of a power difference, because of institutional rules. I am the manager, so I have the right to do this. But that's one of the sad things about bullying. And then the other reason face is important is that a good conversational ability comes from the ability to protect face for ourselves and others. So this is another important principle that's going to come into play a lot as we delve into conversation. Now, this is all framework, basically, for for what we're going to do next now, which is interaction ritual. Now, in interaction rituals, the idea is this, okay? Like I said, we are in a secularly religious society. So one of the implications of that is we engage in what we call, Erving Goffman calls, and I'm kind of a student of Erving Goffman in that sense, interaction rituals. We engage in rituals or proceedings to recognize each other's face, if you will, and to center everything around that. Now, there are two kinds of rituals, and this actually comes from Emil Durkheim, if you're interested. So if you're really liking this stuff, by the way, so you want to look into Erving Goffman, and he's a huge influence of mine, and he even has a book called Interaction Ritual, and I'll write that down here. That's interaction, and then ritual. And then you have Durkheim as well. And if you take a sociology class, you'll learn about him, okay? And he has some stuff as well. Anyways, so you have negative and you have positive rituals. So in negative rituals, these are rituals that involve deference, okay? So that's kind of the key word there, deference, okay? And deference is the yielding to, or the abstaining from something regarding the ultimate. So holiness, right, is kind of an idea of deference. You're staying away from certain things and you're getting out of the thing's way. So like if somebody of importance is walking by, you don't get in their way. You stay out of their way. That's negative. So negative in this case doesn't mean bad. Negative means to abstain from or to not do. Okay, there are certain things you don't do in deference to the person of higher power. Then you have positive rituals, and these are rituals that pay homage to the ultimate. So, giving something to the person of power, providing a sacrifice or providing, whatever it is that you want to give them, money, time, compliments. This is all positive ritual. Now, one of the things that we do then when we look at rituals is what I call the ritual, and Goffman calls the ritual of ratification. Now, the ritual of ratification is this idea that when we're in a social context, so it can be a party, it can be a networking event, it can be a social function, a wedding, any kind of function where there's other people and there's acquainteds and non-acquainteds, so people who you're acquainted with and people who you're not acquainted with. One of the things we do to recognize the presence of another person is this idea of the ritual of ratification. We essentially go through a process of acknowledging their presence. So notice if you go into, so let's start with religious metaphors, or comparison. So when you go into a church, and I think this is true even of a mosque and a temple too, there's usually some kind of centerpiece that you have to bow to show that you've ratified it, that you've recognized its presence. Or think about the military. When a superior walks into the room, usually the subordinates have to salute the superior to recognize the superior has walked into the room. Notice that we often do this in social life too, and that to show ratification is to acknowledge their presence in some way. If you want to see how people don't like each other, if you've seen Maury or any of those talk shows where they'll bring I hate my sister, yeah, my sister hates me too, I hate her too, that kind of thing, and then they bring them on the show. One of the first things that you'll notice is that they don't look at each other. And so that non-looking at each other is them not doing the ritual of ratification, right? They don't want to recognize each other's presence, okay? So, the ritual of ratification then is recognizing somebody's presence, and it can be through a couple of ways that we'll discuss. But this is an important ritual. If you don't acknowledge somebody in a room or in a particular situation, if they don't feel like they're getting that acknowledgement, then that's where you're not paying your respects. Now, with unacquainted people, that might be okay. But where this starts to become a problem is with people who you are acquainted with. So think about when you've been out in public and you didn't say hi to somebody, and then the next day they're like, you didn't say hi to me, and I saw you, blah, blah, blah. This is where we're getting at, and we'll talk more about that later. So in our case then, the ritual of ratification is usually part of a thing called social contact. So it usually leads to something called social contact. And this is when individuals simultaneously address themselves to one another, okay? And it has to be mutually known for social contact. So we're not dealing with parasocial relationships where you yell at the TV, okay? You might be talking to Megan Fox when she's on the movie screen, but she's not talking to you. So there's no social contact there, okay? Or when you're yelling at the football game, you think the coaches can hear you and the players can hear you. Well, they can't. But, you might feel like you're making contact, but you're not. Okay. All right, so there are times then where we make ourselves known to each other and we engage in social activity. Now, there are times where we might look at somebody, but we don't really ratify them, okay? And we don't engage in that social contact. So some examples here. So blind transactions. So think of when you go to the movies and there's the ticket person, after you bought your tickets, you usually have to go inside and then there's a gate. And then there's a person that just kind of takes your ticket, rips it and says theater 8. So in that case, right, when that person tears your ticket, you don't even have to look at them, right? And it's perfectly fine. They're not I ripped Mark, this guy's ticket, he didn't say hi to me, he didn't do anything, he didn't ask me how my day was, I'm so offended. No, because it's like, that's not his job, right? He's just there to rip the tickets, right? And so you don't have to ratify him as a person. You don't have to ask him how his day's going. You don't have to do any of that. If you do that, that's extra, but it's not expected of you because it's a blind transaction. Or let's say you go to a gas station and you go and buy a 7-Up. You go to the table and you just put the 7-Up on the counter. The register guy rings it up. He says, 125. You hand him the 125. You take your receipt and you go. It's a blind transaction, okay? There's not much really there. You also have dead eyeing and that's where you make eye contact with somebody, but you don't make anything of it. So like, let's say, you're in a classroom and somebody's, sitting kitty corner to you, and you look, and then you catch somebody else's eyes looking at that person. That's dead eyeing. And then, one-way contact, obviously, if you see somebody but they don't see you, so like, let's say you're in an auditorium and you see your friend sitting on the front row and you're on the second level. I mean, they can see you. I mean, you can see them, but they can't see you. Now, there are three circumstances for social contact. There's business, and there's accident, and there's ceremony. So these are three general circumstances. These are not the only ones, but these are the most common ones. Now, in a business circumstance for social contact, usually interaction is required, okay? Or interaction is called for, in other words. So if you have a colleague at your work and you're asked to work on this project, that's a business circumstance for social contact, right? You're asked to talk to this person. You're maybe even forced in some way to talk to them. If you do a group project in a classroom, that's business, okay? So work relationships, classroom activities, getting your driver's license, all of that are business interactions. Now, usually these circumstances call for you to be task-oriented, right? So if you're put into a group project or a partner project with a classmate, and you have your first meeting and all you talk about is the movies, right? But you don't talk anything about the assignment, that's a problem, right? And so probably what will happen in the interaction is maybe for the first 5 minutes or so, you'll talk about movies and books and, your favorite TV shows. But then eventually at some point, somebody's going to say, okay, now we got to do this project, right? And that's where you transition into the actual task-oriented stuff. And then you'll work on your task-oriented stuff for a while. And then, when you get tired and it's time to go, then you'll maybe do 5 minutes of, oh, okay, so what are you doing this weekend? Oh, I'm going to go out with my friends, blah, 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 blah. Okay, and then that's where you kind of do your exit ritual as well, which we'll talk about exits in a different week. Okay. Generally, business is supposed to be limited in personability too. So it's like, there's this idea of keep it professional, right? So when you go to like networking events, you don't talk about, I know, sorry, my handwriting is like, I'm still getting used to this pen. Okay. So that says keep it professional. Usually in networking events, there are certain things you don't talk about, right? You don't talk about religion. You don't talk about sex. You don't talk about drinking. So the idea is to keep it professional. Accident is different. Accident is where people serendipitously find themselves in the same social occasion. So like, there's somebody and you happen to be riding the same bus at the same time, or you happen to both be at Hayes or Kroger or whatever. So now you have a social contact circumstance of accident, okay? So I see Chris at Kroger, and so I'm like, oh, hey, Chris, how you doing, man? That kind of thing. And I recognize him, I ratify him, I ask him how he's doing, or maybe I'll just wave at him, but either way, I ratify him. And this is highly contingent on context as to, this is highly contextual, just because depending on where you are, who it is and all of that. If it's somebody that you know quite well, then you run into them at the grocery store, you might talk for 5 minutes. If you're at an airport and you're like on the little escalator thing and you're going separate ways, you might only talk for 30 seconds. So it's highly contextual. Then you have ceremony. And ceremony is intentional, okay? And it's where people purposefully gather for a social occasion. So going to dinner with your friends, having a movie night, having a game night, going downtown with your friends, all of this is ceremony, okay? And the idea is to gather for a specific social occasion. Now, usually in these, you're more personable. You're supposed to be open, right? You're supposed to be able to converse with your partner and, or partners and enjoy their company. Now, here's the interesting thing about business, accident, and ceremony. So the thing is that each of these has implications for how the interaction can go, right? So if you meet somebody in a business circumstance, then there are certain expectations that you have versus a ceremony versus an accident. But of course, and you might have done this yourself or been a victim of this before, somebody can claim to meet you for business, but then turn it into ceremony. Somebody could meet you, could run into you accidentally and turn it into business. Somebody could stage an accident to make it look like an accident when in fact it was ceremony, right? So, or somebody can start off, hey, you want to go get a drink and hang out? Oh, okay, by the way, now that you're having your drink, you should join my multi-level marketing company, okay? So people can try to transform the circumstance into other circumstances or conjugate a circumstance to then create another circumstance. There's this cute girl or cute guy in your class, and you go up to him and you're like, I need help with my math. Will you spend an hour tutoring me? And then so you're like, it sounds like business. And then when they're actually tutoring you, oh, where are you from? That kind of thing. And then you try to turn it into ceremony. Okay, so this happens. Okay, and these have different expectations then for how we interact. Okay, so that's that. Now, here's why this is important. Okay, the conversational implications are this. A lot of this is nonverbal. Okay, so to ratify someone, here's what you have to do. First, you have the eye contact, right? So when you make eye contact with somebody, that's the first key to ratification, okay? Because you're recognizing them. The eyes are the window to the soul. So now all that stuff that I taught you about nonverbal, now this is where it starts coming into play. So to ratify somebody, to recognize them as an individual and no longer as a non-person, you got to make eye contact. The second thing, the rest of these don't have to happen. As long as you make eye contact with somebody and, you can kind of maybe nod or whatever, you've ratified them. But if you can, you might also mirror them. And what I mean is, and this is hard to show with this, but you face them, okay? So if you're in a place where you can face them, so let's say you're walking in two separate directions, like opposite directions, so one's walking north and the other's walking south, and you see each other, you orient yourselves to each other to then ratify and open the conversation. Touch would happen with usually the handshake, right? So that's often how we also ratify somebody, is we make eye contact with them and we shake their hand, right? If somebody offered you their hand and you didn't shake it, somebody will feel violated, right? And they'll be like, I wonder why you didn't shake my hand, okay? So, because that's a violation of the ritual that we all expect. And then you would have your greeting. Now, the greeting is optional too. So you could be in a situation where you make eye contact and you just high five in a passing greeting, and that's all you can do because maybe you're busy, you're running on a track, and you don't have time to just slow down and talk. But usually you'll accompany a greeting with your social contact. And in the next lecture, we're going to talk about greetings. So until then, let me know if you have any questions.